everybody. Welcome to another video for History Valley Podcast. Today, Russell Gmirkin returns to the channel to discuss his article, The War Scroll and Roman Weaponry, Reconsidered. So welcome back to the podcast, Russell.
Yeah, welcome, Jacob. Nice to talk to you.
So let's just start with what led you to go down the path of reconsidering the weaponry in the scrolls. Because I know that in the article, you think that there's been a misconception, a misunderstanding of the weaponry that is discussed and described in the scrolls, in the War Scroll.
Yes, well, in the mid-1990s, I decided to take a systematic investigation of the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as their date and historical context. At that point, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found at the site of Qumran above the Dead Sea. So there was a very common supposition that the leader of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the teacher of righteousness, lived at Qumran. That's where his commune was, his community, and that's where the scrolls were written in the 1st century BC. Well, this is not tenable because the scrolls talk about communities organized by hundreds and thousands and fifties. Qumran at best hosted maybe 20 or 30 residents. So they got that wrong, but that is the view that prevailed into at least the 1960s. So I decided to do my own investigation. There are all sorts of mysterious figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Pesherim, the teacher of righteousness, who was their leader, the wicked priest, who was their opponent, the man of lies, who was another one of their enemies, so on and so forth. So I did a systematic survey of every possible historical clue, all these mysterious figures, every candidate from, say, 200 BC to 100 AD to match them up. And no one else has done that to date. And I find that they all align with the period between about 175 to 163 BC, ending in the Macabean revolt. Now that is about a century earlier than what was then the conventional view. One notable problem at the time is the scroll called The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness, which is usually referred to as the War Scroll. And a critical edition was published in 1962 by General Yigal Yadin, a very famous Israeli military man. He got one eye patch. Anyway, he was their foremost military expert and a great Dead Sea Scroll scholar. And he, very interestingly, he detected a lot of Roman tactics and weaponry and formations in the War Scroll, which the War Scroll is partly a military manual with tactics and weapons and formations and commanders and trumpets and this and that procedures. And then part of it is like an apocalyptic prediction of this war at the end of times when the Sons of Light would defeat the forces of darkness and Belial and all of those guys. So, but the military tactical part reflected Roman customs, military tactics. So therefore, Dean said, well, this must have been, the War Scroll must have been composed after 63 BC, when Pompey, the Roman general, went throughout the whole ancient Near East in his war against Mithridates, and he took over Judea and added it to the Roman territory as a province. So Yadin assumed, okay, Roman tactics, weaponry must be the Roman period after 63 BC. Because before then, he assumed that the Jews used Hellenistic or Greek tactics because they were part of the Greek Near East. That was his assumption. And it was inconsistent with my other conclusions that all this stuff was earlier by a century. So I had to do a systematic investigation of the War Scroll. And I had to become a master of Greek and Roman military history and tactics in the process. What I found was that the War Scroll was indeed earlier and compatible with my conclusions on the rest of the scrolls.
Does it indeed resemble Roman military tactics, or were these the tactics of an earlier culture, someone else in the 2nd century BCE?
Yeah. Well, the Romans had evolving tactics. For instance, starting in the 3rd century BC, clear to around 100 BC, they had their fighting formation was a triple line with Principes and Hastades and Velides, each forming a line in front of the battlefield facing the opponents. And then they had auxiliaries on the sides and cavalry, and it was all very closely integrated. Around 100 BC, and you have something very similar in the War Scroll. You have multiple lines and auxiliaries and a lot of the same stuff. Starting around 100 BC, 104 to 103 BC, Roman general named Marius reorganized the Roman army. He created the cohorts, which are a very famous military unit. I mean, he abolished the 3 lines, and he rearranged a very versatile thing with cohorts of, I think, 100 to 200 troops. And he made the auxiliaries foreigners, and they were of arbitrary numbers depending on what was needed. Anyway, it was a huge revision. And that lasted down to the time of the Caesars and Pompey and Augustus and so on and so forth. So there's a pretty bright dividing line between the old Republican army, which was completely a citizen army of Romans, and then the later cohort armies, which is a later professional army that used mercenaries and all sorts of things. So I contrasted the two. With every aspect of the War Scroll, I compared the War Scroll's description, the pre-Marius description, and the cohort army. And consistently, 100% down the line, the War Scroll resembled the earlier 2nd century BC Roman armies, and not the ones that Yadin assumed. In fact, he made a lot of mistakes. He found stuff really confusing in several respects because the War Scroll didn't match up with the cohort army of the Caesar's day. So, but my hypothesis resolved all that.
So would this indicate that the War Scroll? Well, before I finish that question, let me put it like let me rephrase
Yeah.
it. Um,
Yeah.
do you date it in the mid or late second century BCE?
Um, I date the War Scroll in its final edition to summer of 163 BC.
Okay.
Um, there was a sequel article that I had. Well, first off, my War Scroll article was very well received. It it overthrew the theories of General Yadin, their foremost
Mm.
military expert and the author of the critical edition, just overthrew it, and resulted in my being an invited speaker to this uh, conference in Jerusalem in '97, and it was a big success. In the mid 2000s, that article, I got a message or a letter from Dead Sea Discoveries, the journal. They said this was the most requested article in our history. So
Mm.
it was very successful. But a couple of years later, I wrote a sequel called Historical Allusions in the War Scroll. And uh, I went through some events. There's the first column of the War Scroll describes a series of events leading up to this culminating apocalyptic battle in which they saw the whole forces of Belial being overthrown. And, it talks about traders in league with, the Edomites and the few other groups, and the sequence of events that absolutely line up with the events of 163 BC, leading up to the summer of 163 BC, when there was an apocalyptic battle in Judea. General Lysias, who was a Seleucid general, he arrived with all sorts of forces. The book of Daniel was written in summer 163 BC. It saw the end of the world coming and deliverance from angels, just like the War Scroll. The animal apocalypse, uh, which is a part of the books of Enoch, it was written in summer 163 BC and predicted that Judah Maccabee would overthrow all the bad people in the world and basically establish the kingdom of God. So, um, so these historical allusions uh, fix the date much more precisely even than the military data that I described in my earlier article. And to me, what this indicated was that the War Scroll was the official military manual of the Maccabean army, which is a conclusion of, you know, considerable significance if it's true or if it's accepted. So yes, so I dated in the middle of the Maccabean War or towards the end.
So since it has, since it's describing the tactics of the Roman military at that time period, was there Roman troops or Romans assisting the Seleucids at all against the Maccabees, or were they imitating the Roman tactics themselves?
Yeah, there were military manuals, called Tactica, that circulated around the Mediterranean, around the world. And the enemy of Judah Maccabee, and was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he had some of his army, his prestige guards and units. They were reorganized along Roman lines. I mean, this is just well known and pretty much universally accepted. So these manuals were known in the East, and I forget if it's first or second Maccabees, mentioned how at one point the Maccabees even reached out to the Romans to make a kind of a strategic alliance. They sent an embassy. It might have been in 162 or 161 BC, but they were trying to set up communications. And Bar Kokhba, who is another military expert in Israel, he wrote a great book on Judah Maccabee and Maccabean tactics. He pointed out, and other scholars agree, there were two phases to the Maccabean War. Initially, it was just guerrilla tactics, and then once Judah Maccabee and his brothers started winning some successes, they had a professional reorganization, and they were able to meet the enemy on an open battlefield. And it was probably by acquiring this Roman military tactica and adopting those tactics that they were able to professionally reorganize their army. And there's actually different literary strata to the war scroll. Some of the later chapters were written early and really correspond closely to the early guerrilla tactics of the Maccabean War. Other authors like Philip Davies, they've noted that. And then with this really systematic tactical manual, it's the later professional phase, and strikingly Roman. So,
do you see there being a lot of connections between the Book of Daniel and the War Scroll? And if so, could this indicate that the scribe or scribes that wrote these books had contact with one another, and they probably influenced each other at the same time?
Yeah, definitely. Other authors have noticed verbal similarities and phrasing in common between the last chapters of Daniel and the War Scroll. And they had a very similar apocalyptic viewpoint, God's forces versus Belial, angels coming in and assisting the battle, just a lot in common. And so I do believe there was the authorship was in the same circles. By that time, there's something interesting in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have a series of texts that are called the Syriac texts, the Community Rule, the War Scroll, a couple others that are very organizational, that tell how the community is organized, the leaders, the military leaders, organizations by thousands, 50s, hundreds. Just very, very organizational, kind of like Greek texts that organize religious associations. Then you have another literature that is concerned with laws. It's halakhic. It's all these laws governing what the rules for holiness were for that community. And the two don't really overlap, except, like for instance, the War Scroll and the other Syriac texts, they don't mention the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, any of those. And on the other hand, these other texts, they don't hardly mention the community organization, except the Damascus document. They've identified at least two stages in that one. The early one has all this legal material, nothing about the organization of the community. And then there's some additions that talk about the same organization as in the War Scroll, the Community Rule, whatever. So there's you basically get two communities that merged at one point. And historically, you see something similar during the Maccabean War, when the Maccabean armies went to Transjordan to rescue endangered, exiled Jewish communities there, brought them back to Jerusalem, and brought them into the Maccabean army and organization. And the War Scroll even alludes to this. So I see the authors of Daniel being part of this kind of exiled community that was very persecuted and rescued by the Maccabees. And then they merged, and their literatures start being composite, a combination of both of them after around 163 BC. So it's really interesting to trace all the different groups involved and who their enemies were and what their interests were. The Maccabees, they had a national organization. They were interested in organizing their army and defeating their enemies. And the religious rules and regulations, that was pretty secondary.
Is this also reflected in when they describe their enemies as being the sons of darkness? When these, does that indicate that they view the Seleucids as working with the powers of evil?
Absolutely. The first column of the War Scroll refers to the sons of Belial as they also mention the Kittim of the north, I believe. Anyway, the Kittim, which is a term for Greeks. So, the Greeks appear quite explicitly in the War Scroll associated with Belial and the forces of darkness in this apocalyptic battle. Yeah, that's exactly what the view is there.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Russell.
Excuse me?
I said, well, thanks for joining me today, Russell.
Oh, yes, you're very welcome. I had a good time.
Yes,
and I hope your viewers learned a thing or two.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.